Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of telling titles, looking at songs whose titles tell us exactly what the song is going to be about. Today we're looking at White Ward's Leviathan. And given the name Leviathan, I'm expecting a song that is massive, wall of sounds, exceptionally deep in both the X and the Y axis, just something very larger than life. So, let's dive into this. Check out what White Ward is bringing to the table with the track Leviathan. Yeah, this is a good intro for a Leviathan track. Yes, I dig the saxophone. I'm curious if it's going to get utilized elsewhere, though. Also, where are we going with this? So much buildup. Really interesting to provide that lift. Very cool hearing that moving bass line there. Really nice melody in the guitars over here. See, there's some of that tension. A flute. Full-on black metal moment right here. Oh, I like where they landed there. This is the opening idea, the first time we heard the bands. And that's the same sax part we had at the beginning as well. This is a new section though. Very atmospheric. You know, despite some heavier sections on this track, it goes down rather smoothly. Speaking of heavier sections, okay. There we go. There's some triplets sneakily snuck in here. Oh, it's a fade out? Oh, but we're cross fading. Okay, so we kind of cross faded into a hyper compressed version of it. And it looks like we begin moving into the next track there as well. Interesting. There is a lot of stuff in here that I quite like. I said, it has heavy moments. We have some straight up black metal elements that I was not the highlight of the track for me. But yeah, that kind of goes down smooth. And it's because of all the atmospheric writing, I think. But I've mentioned before, I'm not a huge fan of riffs. And the sections that I was not a big fan of they kind of feel riffier. But I mean, let's get into this, right? That's what we're here for. First of all, does this match the theme of the week? Not really much of an analysis, but I mean, we do have a connective theme. We should talk a little bit about it. I think this is what's interesting about themes like these that are a bit more open ended, rather than when we explore black metal origins, right? We have a very specific type of music and a very specific era that we're going to be looking at. But when we have something like this, telling titles, songs that inform you of what you're getting into beforehand, it requires an interpretation of language. And the thing is that language can mean different things to different people within different contexts. The word Leviathan with no context, I think, is going to evoke ideas of largeness, but what is large? It also has a grandiosity to it as well. It's a very grandiose word. Well, what is grandiose? And so everybody's going to have different interpretations for what Leviathan could represent, and thus the song is going to hit different people differently. I think it's interesting that at least all week so far, Grand Conjuration, well, Death Grips I said kind of fit, but it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, even given that I knew what band it was. Opeth was I was underwhelmed based on the title, and I'm the same here as well. I was expecting something a bit larger than this, and I think it's simply because black metal isn't what I would utilize as a jumping off space for largeness. Black metal and largeness don't go together for me. I just have such a tough time seeing black metal as big. Wall of Sound, yes, but they go the opposite route of big. Big with tremolo picking and lots of attacks. I'm thinking post rock, post metal. Definitely one of the post ones that focus on atmosphere. I'd even say shoegaze could make bigger stuff than a lot of black metal does. And this goes in some interesting directions, but it never quite hits the peaks I would expect given the title. But like I said, that's where interpretation comes in. And I was talking about like word interpretation as well, linguistic interpretation. What does Leviathan mean to you? But it goes the other way as well. What does this song mean to you? This song could feel massive to some people. It never quite it never quite hits that for me, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a massive song. It is definitely big in places, and if you take the entire thing in as a whole, it could have a very large element to it. In fact, it could be something that you pick up on a second or third listen to it, or maybe something you understand in retrospect of the lyrics. Maybe lyrically it's about something much larger than life, in which case some of the musical ideas hit harder because of it. So I'm not saying that it doesn't fit for the week. On a first time listen, though, with no context, I'm a little underwhelmed. I should say, I personally am a little underwhelmed. So, let's dig into what they're doing, though. There's a plethora of ideas in this track. I don't know how we're going to have time to hit them all. Let's just see where this goes, though. Might be a bit more of a surface read today, but we introduced the track with some highly atmospheric piano, saxophone. We eventually introduced guitar and drums. Sorry. And we fully explore this really heavy opening. Lots of space. I think that was one of the big things is that there's a lot of reverb on the opening piano, if I remember right, and it left a lot of room. The reverb just kind of went out and faded naturally. And it's not like it ever hit a point when I was like, oh, that's the end of the sound sphere right there. That's as large as the song is. It never really hit that. It sort of faded out before it hit that point. I'm like, dang, how big is this track? How big is the sound here? And that question is something that stuck with me for a while. Even after we brought in the sax and the electric guitars and the drums, and we further explored a larger version of this opening atmosphere, it's still at a point where I was like, okay, this is pretty big, but we're not filling space yet. How big is this going to get? And see, this also probably led me to have a little bit of being underwhelmed is that the opening, at least the way I read it, indicated a size that they never quite achieved. They utilized this open space in a lot of ways that, at least to my ears, introduce clarity, which we'll touch on when we hit production. Not so much for artistic endeavors, thematic endeavors. And so this whole 3 minute opening before we hit our first bit of vocals, where we're still working with atmosphere building and doing layers, put me in a mindset that I don't know was intentional and that they absolutely did not deliver on. But this idea of an atmospheric buildup utilizing non-metal instruments is something we see a couple of times throughout this track. It also happens in the bridge, which interestingly brings us back to our intro. We bring the saxophone back. There is a momentary flute. I swear I heard a flute play a single note, and it was the only time the flute was present. We also had a trumpet solo in there. We had a beautiful guitar solo. Everything around it was about building atmosphere. We got done with the riffs. We got done with well, the solos are melodies, right? So we didn't get rid of melodies. We just changed them out for non-metal instruments. I don't know what's wrong with me today. Can't stop yawning. That's 3. Let's stop at 3, right? Let's do this. But what's really neat is the way that they go about layering things up. Usually with a slow burn, you're going to utilize sparsity as an accommodity, what's the word I want? As a resource, I think is I don't remember what word I was going for. The larger or more space that an instrument takes up, the less resources you'll have for another instrument. And they're working with quite a few. We're certainly not in a big band or, in a symphony, but there's more than just guitar, bass, and drums here. So we need to be careful with how much space we give instruments. So we give instruments a bit of a bit more sparser ideas when we do slow burns like this, especially heavily layered ones. So I think it was really interesting when we began. We had the piano, and then we added the guitar over it and the bass, and the drums were playing. It's like, okay, we got this real moody element coming in. It's real heavy. Feels like we're going someplace. And on top of all this, we put tremolo picking, or at least very fast 16th notes. I actually couldn't tell. I mean, that's the whole point of tremolo picking, is that it's difficult to hear the picks themselves, or the attacks themselves. But really fast picking, which utilizes a lot of space. These are a lot of attacks in a short time. And yet they made it work. And I think part of it is because once you get to playing this fast with this type of distortion and compression on your instrument, and it sort of just blends into a single note that is a little amorphous. The note itself kind of molds and contorts just a hair. That it essentially moved from being 16 notes per bar to just one, your whole note. And it almost becomes foundational at that point with a bit of texture in your compression. But I was really surprised they went for that in a slow burn, in a section of the track where space was a finite resource, and they just shoved in all these attacks. I'm like, what are they doing here? But it works. And it's because it kind of blends into just this singular idea. So we have these moments of layered atmospheric meditation that focus on. Well, to me, I still think they focus on space, even when we get to the more layered, the denser sections in the bridge. It still focuses on what is around the song, how much space is there, space between instruments, and so the weight doesn't necessarily come from a typical wall of sound, audio just being compressed on you, or you being compressed from the weight of the audio. The weight actually comes from the room around it, just realizing this is a really big sound because we know how big this room is, and it's almost filled up the sound sphere, but it hasn't yet. And we know how big the sound sphere is, so we know how big the sound is, and it adds weight to it without actually hitting that wall of sound idea. It's really intelligently done. Um, Now, aside from these moments, though, well, a variation on these moments would be the solos. We have our sax melody at the beginning, we have our trumpet solo, we have the guitar solo. These are all exceptionally tasteful, and aside from the guitar solo, utilize a lot of space between ideas, which is a very jazzy idea to write solos. It's also just based on the fact that saxophone and trumpet require air, and people need to breathe usually. So space between ideas, between licks, is just going to be a natural element of utilizing aerophones, and it just as an instrument separates itself from the way that guitar solos are written because you don't have to break on them. You can keep playing until your hand cramps. Um, and so we do have this nice distinction there. But what I thought was really interesting was when we shifted over to the guitar solo, we had less rests, but we didn't really move towards shred. We continued on with this tasteful exploration of the section and allowing a melody line to give us extra context to the atmosphere that we're experiencing without necessarily overshadowing it. And so it was really neat to hear the guitar sort of take on its own flavor, but not dive so deep into the typical metal noodling. And I appreciate that. I'm a huge fan of tasteful solos. I'm a huge fan of just tasteful melody writing overall. Never really moving too far into the overly technical, flashy, showy offy kind of stuff. And I know that I use a bunch of negative adjectives for that, right? The opposite of tasteful must be tasteless. And I also say showing off, right? I just don't have better vocabulary for it all. Tasteful just seems to be a good word to find to describe the middle point between too slow moving and not understanding the purpose of the solo within the context of the song, and the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be where the solo itself overrides the song and it no longer benefits the song itself. It's just a moment for the musician to show off or for the instrument to steal the spotlight. Both sides, tasteless isn't the word, but both sides move into extremities of the spectrum that I'm not a huge fan of. I like it in the middle where you can show off a little bit, but everything is in service to what the song is attempting to do. And that's exactly where our guitar sits here. And I think it's just awesome because it is surrounded a trumpet solo on one side, a sax solo on the other, if I'm remembering correctly. It would not have been terrible to have a slower solo into a more noodly slow solo into, another slower one. That would have had really nice symmetry to it as well, but instead they stuck with it. What does the song need at this point? Does it need shred? No. We're not going to give it to it. And I'm a huge fan of that. So yeah, that's sort of a variation of the slow burn section. Now, aside from that, their other mode is the metal. And a little bit of this bleeds into the atmosphere because it's not like we completely disuse drums or the electric bass and guitar during the atmospheric sections, but the metal sections to me are defined by an animosity that typically shows through in speed and power. The slow burns are more about allowing an atmosphere to take shape. And there are places where we will use 16th note picking to achieve that, but it's because that 16th note picking, when done so with the sound, turns into whole notes sonically, as I had mentioned earlier. Here in the metal sections, it's all about the intensity. If you're playing fast, it's going to be different notes. That way they can't blend together. These are the moments where the drummer is really smashing the drum kit. It's where we get our 16th note bass kicks. It's where we get our alternating bass and snare. It's where we get all of the really fast technical drumming. It's where the guitar work begins to shine a little bit in technical proficiency. And it's more about the aggression of the track than the emotion of the track. This is also primarily where our vocals sit as well. We do hear a little bit of vocals in the atmospheric sections, but they are, at least for my memory, predominantly in the metal sections. And I think that fits given the vocal style. We have two types of harshes, a lower growl and a higher. Well, it's higher compared to the growl, but it's a lower fry scream, if I'm hearing it correctly. Um, these are very harsh, and I don't think they blend well in the more atmospheric sections, which I thought it was neat when we did utilize harshes in the atmospheric section. We also brought in the only instance of clean vocals to balance it out a little bit. And we heard some neat counterpoint there. Or one's melodic, one's rhythmic. Is that counterpoint? I don't know. Are they both in the spotlight? Yes. It's a weird area where it's not technically counterpoint, but I'm going to call it that. We have two vocals sharing a spotlight. That's technically counterpoint in a lot of sections. Um, so yeah, back to the metal though. We've got the growls, we've got the aggressive guitaring, we have the hyper aggressive drums, and this section sort of alludes to the black metal foundation more strongly than anything else. At one point, the guitars are playing something a bit more atmospheric, but our drums, constant 16th notes on the bass kicks with some really neat lighter ride cymbal ideas that reminds me a lot of Umgwa. And I need to learn that drummer's name. So instead of just calling the band out, I can call the drummer style out because it is his style. If he leaves the band, it's not the band's style anymore, unless they find someone who drums very closely to replace him. It's his style of drumming. Anyways, yeah, so we get this really neat rhythmic cymbal work on top of this really rigid lower end stuff with the bass kick. We switched that out for a less frequent but heavier drumming style, which makes sense because if you're playing that quickly, you kind of got to be light on the wrist, light on the. Well, the analogy would be ankles, but I don't think many people use ankles to play bass kicks that fast. Maybe they do, I don't know. But when you're playing slower, you can play heavier. You don't have to worry so much about getting to the next hit as quickly. So you can really take your time and get into it. And so we do get these heavier, slower drumming sections that are then paired with the tremolo picking or possibly 16th note picking. So we get black metal drums with atmospheric guitars, and then atmospheric drums with black metal guitar. And we do get a build up at one point um, that I thought was really neat, where we started with everybody playing slow, and then different instruments got faster and faster until it took us to a straight up black metal section. And I was waiting for it because all the foundation was there, and we had kind of nodded towards it. Hey, here's some black metal drums. Here's some black metal guitar. Here's some black metal vocals. But none of them came together at the same time, and it finally lands here. And yeah, it is very in your face. And that's a pretty good rundown of the multiple styles here. A lot of it uses black metal as a foundation, but we explore atmosphere throughout most of it. And I know there's atmospheric black metal. That's probably what this is. But we do fall into some very strong black metal at times. And there is I don't know if I can call it a jazzy influence because it's kind of superficially jazz, but we have trumpet and saxophone solos that utilize some really cool note intervals from outside of the chord that they're in, the key that they're in, to have some really neat ideas melodically going on in them, which is a jazzy thing to do, but I think it's really weird to say that we had a jazz section because I don't feel that very strongly. So yeah, atmospheric black metal with a pinch of jazz, a nod towards jazz. What does this song say to me? Is big, for sure. Not as big as I was expecting, but it has some interesting highs and lows, and the lows give us contrast for the highs to feel bigger. And it absolutely works in some cases. Um, but what is it about? I don't know. The thing with black metal, I've said many times, is that emotionally I just have a tough time connecting with it. And the same is true here. I hear the contrast, I can hear the size differences. I'm there during the slow burns, but I don't really get a story with black metal, and it's because I have a tough time connecting with the chords of it all, I think. Yeah, let's hit some lyrics and see if that triggers anything in the old brain. And this is interesting. The lyrics, most of it went over my head, but I'm picking up on some ideas about the modern industrialization and how it is a crushing weight that keeps us locked into a type of prison. I'm not sure what all of this means, as I stated, but the chorus, I think, is pretty clear. It says, walking across these burial grounds where our skyscrapers rise, searching for evidence that this world is devoted to crashes, a pile of ashes is turned to gold. So the world consistently falls in on itself. It is so addicted to crashes. It's devoted to crashes that we constantly see the rise and fall of empires. Every empire that has risen has fallen, and every empire that is rising will eventually fall. And on those ashes, on that dust, something else will be built that also will be great. As it says, the pile of ashes is turned to gold. And interestingly, the cycle will continue. That gold will eventually erode away and crash as well. It also speaks to what came before us. Our skyscrapers rise on top of burial grounds. It is exceptionally clear visually um, what types of events came before and what we have built over. And it could be a couple of different things that these burial grounds are alluding to. It could simply be, um, the people who lived here before us. It could be the events, the atrocities that reside in our past. But regardless, we praise these skyscrapers that sit here and the ingenuity that goes into them and all of the jobs that they create, and it's built on the backs of those who are dead. And I think oftentimes we forget that. And that's exactly what they're pointing towards here. Um, that's really the only strong section that I have, the read that I have a strong, the only section I have a strong read on. Although verse 3 says, the strongest feeling is burning my mind, my tears fall down dry. I mourn imprisoned in a concrete grave where hatred is tearing me apart. Um, the hatred, I think, is an interesting element because I tend to, uh, when I was reading these lines, I felt anxiety in that, right? Being trapped in by concrete, not being able to see the nature around us. We've completely paved over what the earth is and filled it with concrete everywhere. We're trapped by it. We're stuck in it. It's a prison. It's a grave, as he states. But he calls this hatred. He looks around and is just seething with fury at his surroundings. Those are really the only two sections that I think I have a good read on. But together, they definitely present this idea of something larger than you, larger time wise. It came before you, it will come after you. You will not survive to see the end of this, and you were not here when it began. But even within that massive length of time, it still itself had a past and will have a future where it did not exist. The city you are born in was built on top of a burial ground, and eventually it will fall as this world is devoted to crash. It will become ashes one day. So it's so much bigger than you, but also so much smaller in the scope of history. And yet, as much of a small section of time this is, just the sheer environment and what we have done to the planet we're on evokes so much anger in this person that it tears them apart. It's interesting that the idea of Leviathan, of something larger than life, just something massive in itself, can have so many meanings just within two stanzas. Not to mention the other three or so that I don't understand. And so this anger and contemplation, I think, do resonate in the music in both of its sections. Its more aggressive elements and its slow burns, dealing with the atmosphere of it all. Those are my thoughts on White Ward's Levitation. I pushed that button too early. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments. In the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you here. You can find my music, ways to support the channel, and a link to the Discord server, and a ton more. Just go ahead and check it out. There's a bunch of links in there. It is a tree of links, as the name suggests. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of them. We have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, check you guys tomorrow. 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. We'll continue on with this week's theme of telling titles, and we'll also look at a special selection. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.